going to let us go live now. I think I finally... Okay, I think we're going to be live in just a couple of seconds. Here we go. It's loading up. All right, I think success, better late than never, right? Okay, so we are live, and I will send out the link here. Let me mute this. Okay, so I don't hear us talking over there. And I'll send this out to you guys so you can share. And then I'm going to go ahead and put this on the Luma Learn page. So we'll get a couple people in here watching us, see who's available right now. And then let's see what we got going on. Oh, hold on. So I think, Amy, I sent it to you. Marcella, here we go. So you guys can send this out. If you're, I wouldn't recommend that you watch it right now or it's going to echo back on you. But, and let me get into the Luma Learn website. All right, so Amy, do you want to really quickly introduce yourself and let us know kind of what your teaching experience is, and yeah, just kind of a quick introduction.
Right. My name's Amy. I'm from Pennsylvania. I taught in a brick and mortar school, as we call it in the online world, for 10 years. I've taught everything from literally babies in a daycare through 12th grade in various aspects. I spent most of my time as a reading teacher in K to 6. That was 8 years. The last 4 years I've been teaching online English as a second language.
Okay.
So, yes, I have multiple degrees
All right.
before my education certification. So,
Sure.
lots of experience.
Good. And Marcella, tell us.
I don't have any classroom experience, but I homeschooled. I had 9 kids, and I homeschooled for about 23 years, starting in 1983 when homeschool was pretty new. I'm from Michigan, and let's see, a couple of my kids went all the way from kindergarten to 12th grade before they went to college. They homeschooled, and some of the younger ones only homeschooled for elementary school.
Okay.
It varied, but yeah, we had a lot of fun. Had a lot of homeschool groups, and just did a lot of fun stuff.
Yeah, cool. Well, that's a good combination of people we've got here. And Marcella, your microphone's a little bit low, so I don't know if you have an ability to adjust it or maybe put it a little bit closer to your mouth, but we can hear you. Yeah, I think that's a little bit better. So that's a good combination. So Amy is a longtime teacher and Marcella is a longtime homeschool mom, and I am kind of a combination. I am a homeschooled kid. So I'm a product or a victim. No, I'm not. I loved it, actually. I'm a big fan of homeschooling, but I was homeschooled, and I am a teacher, and I've been, again, teaching kind of all ages. Most recently, I was in Haiti teaching at the university level, and then we had to come back because of the unrest that's happening right there, but I'm still teaching with them. I'm teaching online, so I'm still able to work with my students, which made me very happy I was able to do that. And that's actually thanks to Luma Learn. So it's not just classes that we offer, but we also do hosting for schools and universities and that sort of thing. So that's kind of a nice extra there. So the question we wanted to start out with, or the discussion we wanted to start out with, which I thought would be really interesting, since we all kind of come from different perspectives. And this is a little bit related to kind of what's going on in the world right now. And Marcella and Amy and I, we kind of talked a little bit before briefly about, you know, kind of the topic and where we were coming from. But so the topic we're looking at is, how is it with homeschooling that we can best prepare our kids, prepare our students for the diversity of the world, to make them accepting of different cultures, to make them accepting of different people. And many times when we think of diversity, we think of, you know, the most obvious is just black and white, right? You know, you think of skin color, and that's kind of the thing that we've come to think of with diversity. But there's so much more than that. It's not just skin color. There's cultures, there's language, there's abilities and disabilities, there's ages, there's many different things. So I'm very curious how, and Amy, actually, I kind of want to start with you a little bit, because you mentioned that you're an ESL teacher. So you've kind of had that interaction with the cross-cultural thing. Do you come across some of those? I know when I've taught English, you sometimes have those deer in the headlight looks when you encounter certain cultural things that are different. How do you work your students through that? How do you get them to the other point where they're like accepting, even if they're not fully on board with some of the cultural differences?
I think we talk about it because we experience it too. We have, as part of our group, we're like, oh, what are they talking about? Because there are things you're like, oh, you do that. Just this morning, I was teaching one of my students and they said, you do this in America? And I'm like, yes. And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. Why do you do this? I think we just tell them what we do, try to give them experiences, show them pictures. Be like, we do this here. What do you do? We go through it quite a bit.
Yeah, I think that's really
That's different, like food wise. You eat this with this, and they don't put ice in their drinks. And you know, and here we want ice in everything, and they don't drink cold water, and they don't put ice in their drinks. And when they're sick, they only drink hot things, never cold. In the winter, they don't eat ice cream. So it's very. And I'm like, eating ice cream is
we eat ice cream all the time. It's 20 below outside. Sounds like an ice cream sundae to me, right? I know, exactly.
Just different things.
Yeah, culture is really interesting. That's one of the things. I'm married to a non-American, and one of the things that I get regularly reprimanded for is when I'm sick, drinking anything cold. You know, why would you do that? I'm like, it never occurred to me to not drink something cold when I'm sick. But then I was like, you know, that actually makes a lot of sense. You know, that you wouldn't do that. Why did nobody tell me that before? I mean, you'd think that we would have figured that out, but apparently they figured that out in Haiti before we figured it out here in the United States. So
and everywhere else in the world.
Yeah, right. Well, many places, yeah. I don't know. I guess we're just so used to consuming cold drinks that's the preferred way. So Marcella, what about you? So you've got a bunch of kids, and we were talking about you have a very diverse family, and so how do you think you helped to make your kids so, I don't know, accepting or interested or curious, or I mean, what is it that makes so many of your kids, you know, want to marry into different cultures?
Well, I'm not sure how much of that was what we did or just people that they met maybe, but my mom came from Scotland when she was 17. So I was always aware of the differences that she felt when she came. Like, she couldn't believe these grocery stores and all this food, and she wasn't used to cars and she wasn't used to phones. She did speak English, so that was, you know, one hurdle she didn't have that a lot of our neighbors had. We had about a third Mexican in our town and about a quarter Japanese.
Can you move your microphone a little bit closer to your mouth, because we lost you there? There you go.
Sorry.
Oh,
but yeah, we had a lot of Mexicans and a lot of Japanese, but they were all like three separate cultures. The Mexican kids in school spoke Spanish, and the Japanese kids spoke Japanese, and you know, they only interacted if they had to. But that's when my son went back to school. When he went to school for the first time, he was in 5th grade, and the teacher told me, well, he's already like a year ahead, so can he just work with the Mexican students until, you know, we get where he's at? And I said, yeah, that doesn't bother me. So he actually went to school every day and read to the Mexican students that couldn't read English yet. Okay. So we got all these kids on our baseball team and all these things, so they got to know all the different kids in town, and That helped. We just, even when we homeschooled, we're always looking to invite people over. Russian, a lady from Russia. Um, we had gone to several different churches that were very multicultural, and that was very beneficial. And the kids made a point of studying their culture so that when they came over, they'd be able to talk to them about certain things or play their music, and they really liked doing that. And my oldest son, well, the last I heard, he knows 10 languages, and the girls knew 2 or 3. So they always were really in tune to different cultures and wanted to be more aware of what's happening around the world.
Well, and I think that definitely does attest to your. I mean, you had to have done something because, as you said, in your community, the cultures, the 3 primary cultures you're talking about, were very separate, and I think that's a kind of a sad and a difficult thing about a lot of when you have immigrant cultures. And this, I experienced this even living outside of the United States. There's, in most countries, you'll find that the Americans congregate together. And I don't understand that. Why are you living in another country just to hang out with Americans? But, I mean, I'm there to understand the culture and to get to know the diverse. I mean, I don't mind hanging out with Americans, but it's, that's not the reason that I'm there. So I think that you do have to instill something into your kids in order to help them understand that. And I think with my family, it's kind of similar to what Marcella is talking about. My family was just, my mom especially, well, and my dad as well. They were both very curious about people. And it didn't matter who you are and anything. It was just the more different you were, the more interesting you were, and the more they wanted to talk to you. And I didn't realize how unique that was until much later in my life. And I started to see, how it's so ordinary for people to stick with their own kind. And, kind of, if I speak this language, I want to hang out with people who speak this language. And I was the opposite. I was always going towards the people that were the most different from me because I wanted to understand. And Marcella, you mentioned the languages. I think languages are a really interesting way of incorporating a hunger to understand different cultures. And Amy, you probably have seen that as well because you're teaching ESL and just teaching a language, and with that language comes the culture. So do you see, Amy, when people are, when your students are coming into the culture, that makes them more accepting of differences in people as they learn the language?
Some. We go, because of where I'm from, they're not really accepting of others. So as teachers, we're trying to teach them to be more accepting of others. But they are very excited to know about our holidays and other things and things we do. But
yeah, food is very interesting. Holidays are interesting celebrations, right?
they all
Sports.
they all want to have Christmas. And
oh yeah, right. Christmas is exciting, especially the American version of Christmas,
yes,
because we give a lot of gifts.
Yes, so they want gifts.
Most cultures don't engage in the gift giving that we get engaged.
No.
So it's, and even for birthdays, that was another thing
they don't do. They might get one present.
Yeah, and it's like,
Yes.
we have this enormous party and everybody goes in debt for your birthday and Christmas. So
Yes.
yeah, that's
if they do Christmas, they get an apple. That's usually what they get.
right.
They're like,
right.
"What did you get? Your apple? Did you have Christmas?" They're like, or maybe they get a pen or something.
Yeah, interesting.
But we do try to teach them. But I was gonna say, my community is not culturally diverse at all.
Yeah.
We're very small, so
I grew up in a area that was not culturally diverse in itself necessarily. It was, it was very Caucasian, very much mostly Scandinavian and German heritage, and some Italian. And then my best friend was probably the most mixed person in the entire community. They were a little Hispanic, a little bit, a little Black, a little Native American, kind of everything. And I'm not sure why we just, their family and our family was really, really close. And so you know, that may have been part of it too, is that, you know, I always had kind of, uh, what's the word that I'm looking for? Been drawn to the differences, to the different cultures. But we did have a lot of Native American reservations around, and so there was a lot of exposure to, you know, the diversity there. And even though those cultures were separate as well, uh, to a large part, not entirely, but you know, it wasn't always acceptable for non-natives, even though there's a little native blood, but not enough to count in our family. But it wasn't acceptable for, you know, if you weren't from the reservation, you don't go to the reservation except for the certain times that you're accepted, or in the certain locations that you're accepted. And so, you know, there were definitely some cultural boundaries. But I think just being accepting and being open and going there not necessarily as a tourist to say, oh, we want to observe you as, you know, as if you are something different from us, but instead saying we want to be part of what you are part of. And I think this is one of the things that I find really interesting. You talked about, I think Marcella, you were talking about bringing people over for dinner. This is a really important thing for culture because meals are so important, and eating together is kind of breaks through this boundary of culture. You can go to somebody's event, for example, and this was a thing at the reservations. They would have the powwows and the dances, and that's when all of the white people would go to the reservation. And it was almost, it was a little bit a matter of contention between the cultures, because even though, you know, the white people were going because they were interested and they were, you know, they were trying to embrace this culture and trying to understand the culture, but it was a little bit patronizing, you know, going and saying, we're just going to try to observe you people, right? And it was a us versus them. And that's not what people said. I didn't hear people say that, but that was just kind of, there was this little bit of line between them. But then if you would go and you would invite them to your home for a cookout, or to the park for a cookout with a group, or whatever it was, that would, then you'd be able to cross a whole different line. And this is when I started to find that's what my family would do. They would, my mom and dad, they would invite people over. And so, you know, again, the more diverse that they were, and this could be anything, it could be people from another country, it could be people that were another skin color, people that had a little different religion or different faith, people that had, you know, any kind of ability or disability or age, or it didn't really matter. Big families, small families, you know, little kids, big kids, whatever. And they were bringing people over all the time, and having these meals together, I found really helped to break down some of those barriers. So that's one of the things that I noticed in kind of opening up. So I don't know if you guys have experienced, I know Marcella, you mentioned about bringing people over. I don't know if you made that connection.
Yeah, we did that, and we also lived in neighborhoods. Like we lived in Oak Park, Michigan. On one side of us were Arabs, behind us were Jews, and down the other half of town was black. So it was really, we would be like, they can't get along in the Middle East, so they came to Oak Park, you know. But it was kind of wild. But the kids really wanted to be able to, well, they thought it was cool if they could look at somebody and tell their if they were Korean or Philippine. By, you know, and my son did marry a Korean girl, and she could really point out. She was very, her eye was very tuned, and she could say, no, she's not Korean. I think not, she's not Philippine. She's Hawaiian, and she turned out to always be right. But we
Mm-hmm.
did try to do it. And while we were studying, whatever country we studied, my son would go to the library and get all kinds of cookbooks from that country. And then he would read through them and make grocery lists, and he would buy with my money the food that he wanted to experiment with, and he would feed us according to whatever we were studying. So that helped on all levels. All the kids could participate and start to. They would say, "Well, we should eat this with chopsticks, or maybe we should eat this sitting on the floor. That's how they would traditionally eat this." And then they would also look and see, because you know you can read books from something that happened 200 years ago, and that the people in that country don't do things that way anymore any more than we do what we did 200 years ago. So they really kept track of the time, what this is from. They like to know what major things they went through. If my son met someone from Malta, he could say, well, during World War II, this happened. And later the lady would come back and say, "Oh, you're right. That did happen. I never heard of that before." So it was kind of cool.
Did you incorporate that into your actual homeschool lessons?
That was all part. They got to bring, because we had the wide range of ages. The older kids got to bring in anything they wanted. They could bring in the music. They would get music from different countries to play when we were learning whatever we were learning, and also everybody that wanted to could get extra books from the library. So they liked doing that.
So it was an active part of your curriculum. It wasn't just something that happened. It was, I mean, you started out saying, well, I'm not sure we did anything, but it sounds like you did quite a bit to really, you know, and maybe it wasn't conscious. Maybe it was just you're thinking that, well, of course, we're going to look at different cultures. If we're looking at, you know, geography, we're going to look at the culture. If we're looking at you know, languages, we're going to try to practice them, or if we're, you know, if we're looking at a certain culture, we're going to see different aspects of that. But it sounds like you did try to
It didn't seem as much as it was planned, as just more natural. But
yeah.
whenever we met people, that the girls saw Russian ladies in the park reading their newspapers, and they would say, "Wow, if we could learn Russian, we could kind of talk to them." And then I said, "Well, I don't have time to teach you guys Russian. I really don't." And then the next week at church, they met someone who did Russian lessons, so they got her to come to the house and teach them. Mm-hmm. And pretty soon they could sit there and, you know, not really talk to the people, but share some words, at least show some interest in their culture.
You know, and that's another thing that I've found, and, you know, again, Amy, you may relate to this, again, teaching language. There are a few words in another language go a long way to making a connection. And I think especially, you know, and Amy, I don't know if most of your English students from the same culture?
Yes, they're all from China.
Okay.
Most.
All right. So, and are you teaching them online, or are you teaching them? Okay.
No, it's
okay.
online.
All right. So, and that's the kind of setting where, you know, if you have somebody that you're having a communication issue, or just a connection issue, just knowing a few words in their language really, really can make a difference, because the effort that you have to make in order to learn in another language, especially when you are the majority. And I think about, you know, especially in the United States, we have such a big a common, I mean, you know, maybe not in Amy's community, but in many communities, we have a lot of immigrants, and there's people from all over the world. And just knowing a few words, if you go into a certain community and you know a few words, and you just say, "Oh, thank you," in their language, or you say, you know, "Excuse me," or you say, you know, "Hello, how are you," in their language, a lot of times people really, really appreciate that you took the effort, and that you are not just expecting them to speak your language, but that you're reaching out to them and you're recognizing that their language is valuable. I can't really speak Chinese, but maybe I can say a couple of words. And this is one of the things that I definitely learned in Haiti when I was teaching English there, and I was teaching in the universities. I would play games, and I invented a game where I would have them say a sentence or a phrase in English, and it had to be correct, and then I would have to say the same phrase in Creole, and it had to be correct, and whoever made the mistake first would lose. And so I would play a game with and they thought it was hilarious, because, you know, we would come up with the craziest sentences and try to make each other say them. And so you studied a lot, because they would always try to stump me, and so they'd always have to go in and learn a new phrase to try to see if they could get something I can say. And I learned a lot too. So anything like that where you can laugh at yourself, it really definitely helps. So yeah, for sure. Now, we've been talking about culture. We've been talking about ethnicities and language. What about things like ability and disability? What kind of experiences have you guys had with that? That is one thing I will admit we didn't have as easy of a time, because we just didn't have people. My uncle had some cognitive disabilities, but he wasn't around us a lot, and so we weren't, that was something that I struggled with when I was young. I really struggled with, I wasn't sure how to handle people, especially with cognitive disabilities. That was my personal, now I don't have a problem with it, but when you're young, how do you help kids to get through that, whether it's a physical disability or a cognitive disability?
I would start with books because I'm a reading teacher, but I mean, I know with my church kids and my students, when I was a brick and mortar teacher, I would try to bring in as many different books as I could with all different kinds of diversity, mainly because we are not, I don't live in a diverse area. So, in order to help them understand and know about other people, books are really the best way to at least start and show them some videos and stuff. I guess when
Yeah,
you don't have access to diversity, you do what you can. Now that we have the internet, you can show them pictures and
yeah,
other things and talk about it.
sure. Yeah, Marcella, do you have something to add to that?
Well, I worked in healthcare for a long time, so I was always taking care of blind people or paralyzed people, and I didn't realize it until I was in the midst of it. But they were having so much of a struggle with the caregivers that they would get who couldn't understand that this person is blind. You have to put things back exactly
Mm-hmm.
where they need them put, or they're not going to be able to find them, or they're going to trip over it. So I learned a lot doing that, and I've tried to kind of communicate that. And I think the number one thing now that I'm trying to find a way to explain it more to younger people is the like the autism spectrum and things, because that can be very frustrating for kids who think that this child gets away with doing all these things I'm not allowed to do, and doesn't really understand that child may not have the capacity to control those actions. So that's kind of tricky. It's interesting, but I think some of it is just being exposed to things and having somebody talk you through it when you're going through it. And yeah, this is confusing, isn't it? He keeps taking all your toys, and he isn't sharing that book, but you have to share with him. My little grandson deals with it a lot. He'll call me and say, Grandma, I'm in my mom's room because I want to hit this boy, and I know if I do, my mom's going to be mad, but I'm just so frustrated with him. And I said, I know that is so frustrating. Tell me what he did.
Mm-hmm.
But at least he's getting the awareness that this is something he's got to learn to deal with.
Yeah, that's good. Learning that self-control is important. We all have to learn that. And sometimes it's not, it's not any sort of disability. It's just personality differences. But
That's
yeah,
true.
Amy, what you said about the books was really interesting. And this kind of goes back to culture or to ethnicity as well. But the first book I remember being assigned was Up from Slavery. And it's interesting because I hear people saying, well, when I was in, and this was actually in a private school, but my dad was the principal, so it basically was homeschool. When I was before we were homeschooled, and it was the first like real literature book I was assigned, and I was fascinated by that story. And I just thought Booker T. Washington was the most amazing person in the world, and I just everything he said was just so amazing to me, and he was so full of wisdom, and I was just I think um, that is definitely a big part of that. And there's so many books and there's so many videos. I used who is the guy, Nick? You guys might know. He's
Vujicic,
Yes, that guy, I can't say
Nicholson.
his last name. He is the
I think it's
Australian guy that
Vujicic.
doesn't have
I'm
arms and
saying
legs.
it right. Yeah.
Yeah, he's so cool. And I mean, he's
Hmm.
just such an amazing person and just such a great personality and so inspiring. And I showed that video to my students in Haiti because in Haiti, there's this thought that when somebody is disabled, they're just kind of they're not really fully human, but also they have the other side where a lot of Haitians are very very accepting of differences, like it's just normal. So if you're different, it's differences are more, especially cognitive differences and difference in ability of learning and that sort of thing, are more accepted in Haiti, I think, than they are here. And that's partly because they don't have institutions like they do here, where people are kind of separated from the rest of the population, and they don't have special ed classes. So you know, you're not separated from those with the needs, you just learn to deal with it. So I think there's some advantages but when people have really severe physical deformities, they don't get the sort of therapy and the sort of, you know, ability that they do in some of the more developed countries. And so when I showed them this video, they were just astonished. And then of course, you know, I told them, I said, you know, he's a self-made millionaire, and they were really astonished. And then I showed a picture of his family, and they were like just stunned. And it really kind of, you could see these, you know, their mind kind of trying to process this idea. This guy had every bit of disability, and yet look at what he made out of his life. And so it was really interesting to see that, and see, you know, only through the internet was I able to present that to them. Without that, you know, years ago, we never had any opportunity to see something like that. And especially in Haiti, where they didn't have the technology until really recently. So yeah, fascinating. Well, it's I really enjoy talking about diversifying things. I wanted to talk about another topic, and this kind of goes back to what we were just saying, Amy. One of the other questions that we had here was, what kind of books, and this, I think Amy will be interested in this one in particular, what kind of books should I be recommending or requiring for my kids as I'm homeschooling? And I know it depends on the different grades, but what are some of the essentials, and why?
I read everything. So my students read everything. We read. I think some of the classics are good. I but you also want to do some modern ones. I like Anne of Green Gables. Gary Paulson's popular. Like
So
maybe
what do you start a kid with? Say a kid that's in third, fourth grade, they're really just starting to get this facility of reading. Um, and maybe they're not sure if they like reading yet, but maybe they're not completely turned off from it. What would you recommend to kind of pull them into it?
it depends on what they like. So I would recommend whatever they like outside. So if they like sports, read sports. If they like magic, read magic. If they like history, read history. There's I would start with what they like, especially if they're reluctant readers,
Hmm.
because once you get them into reading what they like, they go, "Oh, I like this." And you might even, some people disagree, start with comics like
Hmm.
Geronimo or Nate the Great, Geronimo Stilton, those graphic novel type books,
Yeah.
because at least they have a book in their hand. So if you get them reading, then you can build on that. But some of the series, my students always love Magic Tree House, Boxcar Children, Junie B, Jigsaw Jones, Little House if on if they're a little bit more advanced. I
Yeah.
could go on forever, but
And those books have been around forever.
yeah,
We
they
just keep
have it.
reading the same ones, and they're still really good.
And yes, and they like Judy Bloom,
Okay,
some of
good.
the Ramona. Yes, like
Marcella's nodding her head like those
and
are the
We did
ones
a
that
lot
you
of
use.
sunlight with the literature-based history, and so every day I read aloud while the kids either colored or did Legos or drew, or sometimes they'd clean the kitchen if they wanted me to read longer or whatever. And we read everything. We read Tales of a Korean Grandma and Young Fu of the Upper Yangtze and all these books, and they were so interesting. And but because we had everybody listening from the little to the older, then they could discuss it like for weeks. They would talk about it, or even a year later. Oh, remember that? What happened in that chapter when he was doing this and that? So we just love the read alouds, and I really still think that was one of the most advantageous parts of our schooling, that we got to read about all these cultures and all these countries and all these different times. And when the kids would play, they'd say, well, let's make believe this, and then they'd say, well, who's the president? And they'd go look at the placemat with the presidents, and they'd say, my daughter would say, so what kind of stove would I have to cook on? And did they have gas in the house? Did they cook on a wood stove? Are they cooking outside or whatever? So they would go and they would play this, and they would get all those pieces that they had read about and put them all together, and they could play. Of course, the boys usually were playing something where they were soldiers or something like that. But they played a lot. They played a lot of these stories, and I think it made it, everything became so much more real to them.
Do you
Yeah.
think that your kids became better readers because you read aloud to them?
Some of them were always really strong readers and some were not. But at least when we did the read alouds, everybody got the benefit of the book, even if they weren't going to ever sit there and read the whole thing themselves. They all can read fine. Now, I mean, there's a point where you wonder sometimes if this person's ever going to pick up a book on their own. But
Hmm.
they can all read fine. But also we did. I learned when we were in town and the younger kids were in school, a lot of times the Mexican kids would be coming over and they'd say, "I've got to read." Well, the one I remember, one boy said, "I have to read To Kill a Mockingbird, and I'll never get through this book before the end of the year." So I said, "Well, wait a minute, we'll go get some audio tapes." And
Hmm.
so we got those and let him listen. Now, he was never going to read it in English before the end of the year, but because he got the audio tapes, he did get to finish that thing and got the idea of it. And we did have to talk him through certain parts that he just didn't have the background to understand. But those things worked really good. So I do think even if they're not able to read on their own, if you're going to be able to read it to them, you're going to supply a lot of the missing parts.
Yeah, that's interesting. A few years ago, oh, actually quite a few years ago now, I think I was in my 20s, I decided to read the complete works of Shakespeare. And I was like, I'm never going to get through here because I just got one of the, I went to Barnes Noble, got one of the great big, bargain complete works of Shakespeare. And I was like, I'm going to read this whole thing this year. And I was like, I'm never going to get through this. And then I discovered the books on tape at the library. And that's how I read it. I would read it. I would sit there and read it, but I would listen to it at the same time. And I made it
Right.
through that way. And it was so much easier. And I'm a reader, but Shakespeare is not easy to read, especially the whole thing. And so, yeah, I just took one story at a time and one play at a time and listened to it and read it. That's a good way to do it. And now those resources are so much more available. I use this for, again, my English students. Just go on the internet and you can find all sorts of books read aloud and the words are right there. And so it's a really great way to get them reading without even realizing they're reading. And another way is, of course, closed captions. If they're doing second language, especially, so watching a movie and then listening to the closed captions in that same language, or watching the closed captions in the same language as they're listening to the movie is another really good way. So.
The research says that you should still read to older kids too.
Hmm.
Like your older students read aloud, and it helps them with comprehension because you can read them something harder than they can read themselves. So it's like what Marcella was saying. It's good to still do read alouds.
That's really interesting. That's something I haven't heard a lot. I don't know if I've heard that before at all, but because we often think of story time being for little kids, not for older kids. So that's a really interesting um, idea of reading aloud to older kids. And I'm trying to think of when I've heard that done, and other than like in a literature class, where that's actually what you're supposed to do when they get up there and say, I'm going to read a passage. I haven't really heard that done at all. And that would be
Mm.
something that I should read that research. I would be very interested
You
to.
should also read to babies too.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, I know everybody talks. Oh, I hear about people talking about babies and, like little kids, but then once they get to reading themselves, you're like, they just read, or they read to each other. And I think that's a really good, that's a really important resources to have the older kids reading to the younger kids, or even vice versa, just reading together, because it's easier. And it's the same thing with language. I was talking to my niece and I said, oh, my niece is Mexican, and so I said, oh, we can practice Spanish. And she said, my husband's trying to learn Spanish too, but he's embarrassed to talk to me. And I said, but he won't be embarrassed to talk to me because I'm not good at it either. And so sometimes it's easier for two kids to read together because they know they're both going to make mistakes, where mom might be a little bit more intimidating because it seems like she's so good at reading, if she is. But so I think a lot of times putting the kids together kind of helps to alleviate a little bit of the insecurities. Yeah.
You can read to
And
your dog too.
read to your
Like,
dog. Yeah,
like
I
they,
would I
they
would
have.
speak. I practice languages with my dog, so I talk to my dog in Creole and Spanish and whatnot, and she loves me no matter what I say, so it's all good. So what about now? we're talking quite a bit about reading, but how do we then, and moving away from the cultural stuff, but just getting to curriculum in general, how do you think, how would you advise, and I think Marcella, especially since you've been through this, you know, more than a half dozen times, how would you advise parents, and I'm sure when, you know, when you were homeschooling initially, it would have been a little bit different setup because you probably didn't have the constant access to the
We didn't have
internet.
internet.
Yeah, we
We
didn't have
didn't have
internet growing
homeschool
up.
groups.
We
Nope.
had
We didn't
old-fashioned
have
books and
curriculum.
pencils.
Could not buy teacher books.
Hmm.
So yeah, that was a little bit different.
Yeah, we had, there were
I
basically,
cried a lot in those days.
I think there were three main options for Christian curriculum. There was
Rotten
Abeka,
Stick. Becca was no
ACE,
teacher books and Paces.
ACE, PACES, which is what I primarily went through, and Bob Jones.
And then Bob Jones, they came next. Yeah. And
Yep.
that was a big, that's when it started to open up.
Right. And those, that was it. Those were really the only
Yeah.
options you
Christian
had.
Liberty Academy, where you sent your paperwork in every week.
Yeah, we weren't fancy enough to hear about them. Well,
It was great.
I think they came, well, I mean, I'm a lot older than your kids, I think, but,
My
or at
oldest is
least,
48. She started homeschooling when she was 11.
oh, okay, well, then about the same age. So, yeah, so yeah, we didn't know anything about Liberty, but I was the youngest one too. So,
Okay.
so we were kind of on the opposite sides of that. So yeah, yeah. When your younger kids came along, maybe you had Liberty, but I didn't hear anything about Liberty. I would have loved that, some sort of a change, some sort of a challenge. That would have been great. So now, how would you recommend parents, and you know, and we might be on the other side. Amy might actually be a little bit more into the technology than you know, I'm not as used to that. How do we balance books, curriculum, and in books, I mean, like, you know, kind of designing your own curriculum, and then formal curriculum and online learning? How would you balance that?
We let our kids take some classes online, like the second oldest, the third oldest. There's 10 years between my first two, so they were able to take AP classes online, which they could not have taken at our local school because it was too small of a school. So they took AP English and AP Music Theory. That was the first time I ever heard of an MP3 or MP2, I think it was at that point. They had to download this, and we didn't know what that was about at all. That went pretty well, and they did take some other. I'm sure my oldest son took a bunch of classes. He also went to the college to do the dual enrollment when he was in 10th grade. He actually finished homeschooling when he was 15. So the next 2 years, he got to just do whatever he wanted to do. And then the younger kids got to take even more interesting classes. They got to take logos to Legos, where they learned programming, and then they programmed their Legos, and they made interesting little things. And I always tried to get them to do classes like at Greenfield Village. They did wheat weaving, and they rode the old trains. They just did a lot of different. We'd take them to Cranbrook or whatever museums we could for just different exposure. They made mousetrap cars and different things. Some of the kids that we knew, my kids didn't get to, but they made their own computers. So that was pretty cool. But just whatever they could do. My second oldest son, my oldest son came to me one weekend, and my second oldest son was not like academic as the older kids, and he really struggled with a lot of things. And my oldest son said, "Mom, I don't want to get Ben in trouble or anything, but he flew on the flight sim all weekend." And I said, "So that was good?" And he said, "Yeah, he didn't use any of the safety features, and he never crashed." And I said, "Okay, so what would happen if you did that?" He goes, "Oh, I crash every 15 minutes." So I said, okay, so he really likes this. He said, "Yeah, he is really good at this." So I ordered some books without even seeing them that were about flight and stuff, and we got those for Ben. Well, when they came, they were like college level, and he's like 13. I'm like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Ben. I thought you could do this." Well, he did do them, and he read them over and over and over and over. And when he went into the Marines, they trained him to be a Marine helicopter mechanic. And when he had to do all of his aerospace stuff, he did he did great on it. And they said, "Well, how come you can do this?" And he'd say, "I'm so homesick. I just keep reading all these books over and over." And it was so cool that we found something that he could do. I mean, he hated the academic stuff, but once you got flight involved or anything like that, he could just take off with it. So it's a good thing to always be looking to follow their interests. I mean, they do have to do things that they're not interested in, and that can be a struggle. But if you can find things that appeal to their interests, it takes away a whole lot of the did you get your schoolwork done? You know, they're going to be excited to do it. And they're going to be looking for other things to do. So.
Yeah, and you know, I find that one of the better ways, and this is with anything, I use this with the university students, I use it all the way, down to my elementary students and whoever else, is have them design their own curriculum. And just say, okay, these are the parameters, this is what you have to do. You have to pick a science topic that needs to fall within XYZ. You need to pick a history that needs to fall within XYZ. You need to pick this and that. And if they design it themselves, then they're invested into it. And so it's more like, okay, I need to make sure that I'm actually going to enjoy this. I need to make sure, because I'm going to have it for the whole term or for the whole, what it might be a year or whatever the amount of time is. I think that can be really helpful to have them as involved as possible. So how would you now, so Marcella, hearing you kind of go through the different kids, everybody was at a different level of technology, of course, with the 10-year gap and whatnot. So I'm sure things were getting a little bit more technologically advanced as you were going through that. But now, if you gave advice to parents starting out now, how would you divvy up the day? I mean, would you really focus on having a curriculum as your center, or would you, what advice would you give for a parent kind of starting out?
The things that I think worked the best for us and that were most efficient was using a literature-based program. Following a timeline, reading history along the timeline, bringing in maps, bringing in different things. But then, you've got this core that's tying things together. You can get books from the library, you can get books from anywhere on all different levels. And always let the kids read for their pleasure reading. Let them read something that's easier. If they're reading at a 4th grade level, but they want to get out a 2nd grade level book, that's totally fine. I can read at a college level. I don't want to read that way every day. I'd be exhausted. When I was in college, I was exhausted all the time. It was so much, but you can read at a lot easier level. And there's always just so many things that you can see they're developing an interest and take off on it. Like Sam, he wanted to do the foods. Well, that worked out really good for all of us, especially me. And I didn't have to make dinner for 2 years.
Yeah, good.
That was great.
Yeah, my mom actually did that when I was 10. She bought a little kitchen, like one of those antique kitchen, cupboards, and got the cookbook. I think the cookbook's probably still at her house, and made me the apron and the hot pads and all that, because she's a very good seamstress, and did all this stuff. And she said, okay, now your job is to make supper, whatever number of, and this was before we were actually homeschooling, but that was part of my education anyhow, and it was great. But I was actually, you were talking about your son, I was actually the opposite, where I would have my college level zoology books and other books that I got from garage sales. Every time we went to garage sales, I'd go right for the books, and they were always like 25 cents or something like that, these big textbooks. And I would pick up these college textbooks. I was 10, 11 years old, and I would have my paces, when we had ACE, my paces open over the top of those books. And every time my mom would leave the room, I'd close the, 5th grade book, and I'm reading the college level stuff. And she's like, what do I do with this? How do I deal with the fact that she wants to read college level stuff instead of her 5th grade stuff, but she has to do the math? And I didn't want to do the math. I wanted to read zoology instead. And so she just basically said, once you finish your schoolwork, you can do whatever you want. And that was my fun. I would read college level books. And I did the same thing. I finished school when I was 15. And that's actually when I started to teach, is because I found out that I could tutor kindergartners, and so I started tutoring kindergartners when I finished all my work and went forward. Unfortunately, we didn't know anything about being able to take AP classes or anything like that. That was my mom didn't even realize that was an option for me. Otherwise, I would have definitely taken that.
Every year we learned more things, and we wished we could have done earlier, but it all worked out.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I turned out more or less okay. So yeah, just despite, the challenges of being in a small community, and Amy, you have that probably too. So you probably don't have all of the resources that some people might have in larger cities. So what do you think would be the challenges of somebody in a small community or maybe in a rural community as opposed to the city? And I mean, of course, the internet can really help that a lot, and there's a lot of advantages of being in the country or being in
There
a
is,
small
but
community.
you might not have internet. Where I
Mm,
am, there are people that don't have internet, so they're currently trying to do online and they can't.
hmm.
So they're hindered. So you may have to go to the library or use
Right,
the
and the
internet
libraries are
there.
all closed
But
right now.
yet
Right.
ours thankfully are open, kind of, sort of.
Hmm.
But not fully, but we can go back now. But when it was closed, they did make the library Wi-Fi better, so people were driving to parking lots and doing school all day. So
Oh, I
I
did a
guess,
lot of my college homework at McDonald's,
yeah,
and you'd
Yeah.
have to figure out what restaurants would close at 10 o'clock because you had to get out to the other restaurant to make sure you could submit everything by 11.
Yeah. Or you sit out in the parking lot. I've done that too. Like you find the right one and you just sit out in the parking lot. You got the login saved in your computer, or your phone, or whatever, and yeah, I have I have definitely done that. And again, living in the uh, developing world, or the majority world, however you want to call it, has been a big challenge. And right now, my university students are going through the same thing because they're in Haiti, and there's blackouts. Every single day there's blackouts. That's the norm rather than the exception. And so, yeah, it's always like, well, I didn't have electricity again, but I tell them, I'm like, you have lived in Haiti your whole life. You know that this is the case. You know there's blackouts. You got to prepare for it. I will work with you, but you got to give me something too. You can't get to the end of the week and say, "Sorry, I didn't have electricity," because I know you've had electricity some point in this week, and it's up to you to use it, as much as you can. But yeah, I think we've got to work through our challenges, but then also realize there's a lot of advantages of that too. So even, like I was saying, you might live in a small community, but you can have a lot of advantages where in the big cities, a lot of times we're more secluded. So there's a lot more community. Not always, but in many cases there's more community in the smaller
neighborhood.
areas.
So yeah. Use books, talk to other people. They can teach you.
Yeah.
I'm
That's
use
it.
their use them because there are people that know lots of things like sewing or math, or they're good at cooking or farming. So you can do the sciences and the other things with in a different way. I guess small town is a little different than
Absolutely.
the big city.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a lot of, and you can get by with a lot of stuff in a small town that you can't get by with in the city because people are much more understanding. And again, this was a long time ago, and right now, I'm sure it wouldn't be allowed, but again, I was reading the zoology book, and my mom's like, "Well, this is what she wants to do," and I was convinced I was going to be a vet. I'm clearly not a vet, but that was what I had decided I was going to do. And so my mom called the local vet clinic and said, "My daughter's homeschooled and she's really interested in vet science, and can she come and volunteer?" And they took me 2 days a week, and one day we would stay in the clinic and one day we'd go out to the farms, and I got to do all of the gross vet bloody, nasty stuff. And it was fascinating to me. I would be so excited, and I'd get back and smelling like cow and everything. And my mom was like, "Okay, go take a shower first and then you can come and tell me about your day." But it was, experiences that I had that very few people would have, and that's part of being in a small community. So I think the take the opportunities as they come. And I really think, it sounds like, both of you guys and myself, we're kind of saying the same thing, that you can't be too strict. You can't just say, "Okay, now we're going to go through XYZ curriculum," because it doesn't work for every kid, right, Marcella? I mean,
Right.
you're
And
talking.
even I couldn't even hardly use the same books 2 years in a row because these kids are different from those kids. But my kids all did. With the 8 younger kids, they all schooled two together. So the oldest two, then the next two, then the next two, and that worked. Usually one struggled a little bit more and one had a little easier time, but it just it worked fine, and we were not under a lot of pressure. Like, you don't have to finish every page of every book. You never do that in public school. So,
Right.
why we put that on ourselves? We were very, well, when I first started homeschooling, people would go to jail for homeschooling. So we were really nervous about it. But you don't have to be like that. You can just be really relaxed with the kids and encouraging. One thing that we did, though, and I think this helped me the most of all the different rules we made, we did Fridays was a field trip day, and we had 4 or 5 other families we met together. And we'd go either to a park or to the zoo or to Greenfield Village. And anybody that wanted to go on the field trip had to turn in all their schoolwork by Thursday night. And if they didn't, they were going to stay home with one of the moms, or one of the moms would stay home with whoever was sick. Nobody ever was sick on Friday, and nobody forgot to do their work, because that
Right.
was like such it was, and it ended so much of the nagging or frustration of, if you don't get this done, you can't go on field
Yeah.
trip. No, just don't say anything about it. They know it's there,
Hmm.
and they became really self motivated.
Yeah. Reward based is really effective.
It
For
is,
sure.
and
For
it was
sure.
really much better for me too, because who wants to be home with a mom that's crabby all the time? Nobody.
Right, exactly.
And
Oh, I
kids
know.
at
Who wants to
home
be home with
too.
mom all the
All
time?
kids.
And
Yeah.
I think, you know what? Oh, I think that field trips are really important. I think that is something, you got to get out of the house. When you're being homeschooled, you have to have an excuse to get out of the house. Just find an excuse. It can be a nature walk. It can be, going to the neighbors and, volunteering and raking leaves for the older couple down the street or whatever it is. Just do something, whether it's a
Ours did
volunteering
music
or.
lessons too, so they always knew they had that music lesson and then orchestra on Tuesday night or whatever. So
Yep.
they knew they had those things. They were counted more as school though.
Yeah, one of the advantages I think we have right now, I think COVID has actually done a great service to homeschool, because it has taken it away from being this kind of weird outsider sort of thing that happens, and it's mainstreamed it, big time. And so now it's almost trendy. It's gone to the other extreme where, it used to be very, very conservative Christian, almost Amish people would homeschool. Those were really the only people that would homeschool. Now there's like these big groups of secular homeschoolers that, I mean, like they're going like the other extreme, both sides of the spectrum are embracing it wholeheartedly. And instead of it being something weird, it's almost something to be lauded, and something to be a, uh, a focus or a
It's
goal
almost
for parents.
fashionable.
What was that?
It's almost fashionable now.
Yeah, it is. It is. And
So the
that
lead
might be
free.
a problem, in a way, but I think it's an advantage too. So there's so many resources right now, that are coming up, and some of the resources that are trendy, they kind of fall away with if they don't have real substance. But I think the resources that are really showing that they have the substance, and the teachers that are showing that they're consistent and they're having really good material coming out. There's so many resources. And if you have a kid that's not getting a certain topic and a certain subject, the parents don't have to worry about it anymore. And for me, it
Right.
was algebra. I couldn't get it. And my brothers were like brilliant with algebra. They just do it in their brain without even thinking about it, which I didn't relate to at all. And my mom, she's not a math person either. So she was like, I don't know what to do with this. So, if I had had some of those resources, it would have been a lot easier and a lot less headache and tears for both me and my mother. So I think that there's a lot of advantages. So do you ladies have any final words that you'd like to leave our listeners and watchers with? Any final words of advice for maybe first-time aspiring homeschool parents?
Remember that you got to enjoy this. The only way it's going to work is if you try to enjoy it. You make time for the light and easy things. Um,
Enjoy
don't
it.
stress
Yes.
yourself out.
Yeah, good. Amy?
It follows your interests as much as possible. Makes life a lot more interesting. And another outing if you're allowed is to go to the library. I do the story hour if we're ever allowed to go back, and we have mostly homeschooled students there. So
Good. Yes,
Yes,
libraries
we
are
love
a
our
great place.
library.
Yes,
I just spent an hour ordering books on the library for me, so I'll have all
Yeah.
them coming in the next couple of weeks.
Yes.
Yeah, that's like
Just had
Christmas
to
for me. All the
wonder,
books
why
are
is
coming.
this 60-year-old lady ordering kindergarten and first grade books all the time?
Yep.
Yeah.
Because yes, that's what I do. So.
They're great reads. Some of those classics are really good. So, all right. Well, it was great getting to know you ladies and talking, and we'll hopefully have you on again, and we'll see how this time works. I think, you know, we're trying out a new time for the live stream that works better for our teachers, and hopefully our moms get in and start to notice. We didn't really advertise this because we're giving it a last minute try, but we'll see you guys again, and we'll see our audience next week at this time. And you guys have a great day.
Thanks.
You too. Thank
You too.
you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.